I look forward to finally being able to use some of these principles from the Bioelectric, to use electric fields to precisely modulate and guide the healing process in the body. I think that it's possible to have salamander-like regenerative properties in humans. I don't know if that's the next 5 years or the next 15 years. One of the things that I think that's true. What I'm consciously even probably more aware of is really leading the conversation in this nervous system first approach and really helping people think about the software at least as prominently or at least as early in the rehabilitation process as they think about the hardware, where we've been in this model of a very hardware dominant, hardware focused paradigm where the interventions are focused on the structures and tissues of the body. So that's where I think about, and the electroceutical piece, the electrical piece of that sort of dovetails with it. But I'm excited for that.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Smarter Not Harder podcast. I'm your host today, Boomer Anderson, and it seems like I come back on the podcast as a host, oftentimes to interview people that I have the pleasure of calling friends. And today, that continues to be the case. The interview that you're going to hear was recorded a couple of days ago between myself and a good friend who now resides in Austin, Texas, Garrett Salpeter. And Garrett Salpeter is the founder of NeuFit and the creator of the Neubie, one of a personal favorite of my devices in this health space. And Garrett's story goes way back to 2007, where he suffered from all kinds of injuries related to a mutually favorite sport, ice hockey. And he used his knowledge of physics, engineering, and so many other things to basically rebuild his body using direct current machines, devices that later became the Neubie. This episode is a diving into this emerging world of what we'll call electroceuticals, or just the use of electricity and DC currents as well as AC currents to improve health. We talk about the work of Robert Becker and something that you guys might have heard of called the Bioelectric. We get into a Soviet training methodology referenced in super training. And then we go into the different use cases of direct current as well as other forms of electricity for healing the body. This includes things like nervous system resets, physical therapy, and so much more. If you enjoyed this conversation, please smash or give us a like, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on all the social medias, and leave a 5-star rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening to this. Let's get on to my conversation with Garrett Salpeter. Garrett Salpeter, welcome to the SNH podcast.
Thank you, Boomer.
One of my favorite times to host this show is when I've known somebody for a long time and can start off with just simple questions like, what do you expect the Bears record to be this year?
I predict they're going to break the 500 barrier and actually have a winning record this year. I'm feeling bullish. I got to work with Caleb Williams a little bit this offseason, which was a very cool experience. But with him and the new coach, Coach Johnson there, I'm feeling optimistic.
And I have to say that there's a little bit of a jealousy bone that's tickling me right now, because as a lifelong Bears fan, which has been painful, you still would like to get to meet somebody that's a franchise player like Caleb. But I want to dive into your work, what you do with NeuFit. But first, take us through the history of Garrett and how you kind of came to focusing on the body, because if I remember correctly, your background's in engineering, right? How does, take us through engineering, what you focused on, and then what was sort of that light bulb moment where you said, hey, I think I can help people. What really triggered that for you?
There definitely was a few of those moments along the way. For me, I I feel so grateful to have found this intersection where my academic interests in engineering and neuroscience overlap with this passion I had for physiology. And for you SNHers listening to this, if you're a provider, you likely have something that got you interested in physiology and fascinated with the human body. And for me, it was my time growing up as an athlete. I played ice hockey growing up in the Chicagoland area. And
what position again? Remind me.
I played mostly defense. In high school, a couple of years, I played offense. Scored a few goals back then, but and so for me, it was this love of that sport that actually motivated me, inspired me to start reading about strength and conditioning and learning about speed, like speed training and how to get faster. Because for me, that was sort of the limiting factor for me. And so I got really fascinated with this notion that I could put in the work and achieve a result and improve myself and build up my body and become better and more skilled. And so I got really, really interested in that. And then fast forward to college, I ended up playing, Division III college hockey, pretty good. Even then I was mostly a practice squad player and, stuff like that. But I had this amazing experience where I had some torn ligaments, I had this injury, and I was told I was going to have surgery to repair them. And I met a doctor who was doing functional neurology and using older versions of direct current. So it's like older electrical device with analog dials and stuff like that. And I did some of these treatments and I was just blown away. My ligaments healed on their own in a few weeks. I was able to avoid surgery and I was, relieved and really pleased and happy to be back out on the ice and avoid surgery, right, as an athlete. But also as a physics major, as a pre-engineering student, to find something that made sense scientifically from first principles, that's what really got me excited. That really spoke to me, and it created within me this calling to take this work and share it with as many people as I could. And I had no idea at the time that it would eventually turn into, creating a patented medical device and launching a company to share that with the world and things like that. But it was really that moment that set me off on this path.
So I want to go into that for a second, because when a lot of us listening to this think about health, we think about nutrient networks of the body, balancing our hormones, but we may not think about sort of the electrical currents of the body. And maybe if you can give us a little bit of a primer on, how this functional neurologist and what they were teaching you with direct current or whatever, how that plays a role in the body. Because on the show, we've had like Dr. Ted talk to Michael Levin, who's doing some fantastic or very interesting stuff with electrical currents. But take us through a little bit about, electrical currents, how they influence the body. And I mean, look, that alone could be a PhD dissertation and probably several PhD dissertations. But many people may not think about the body as an electrical current, a series of electrical currents. And so how did this functional neurologist educate you, and how have you educated yourself about that? And what have you concluded?
There's a lot to it here. In terms of my experience, part of why it impacted me so significantly was the contrast that I experienced between that and the prior experiences I had with traditional physical therapy, traditional orthopedic medicine, where it was more, wear this brace, take this anti-inflammatory, get this surgery. There was never any mention of the nervous system, nor was there any mention of the body's, innate ability that we all have to heal, to recover, to adapt, to grow, all these different areas that I didn't know how to articulate at the time, but I did feel like something was missing. I felt, disenfranchised, disappointed. And so when I had this experience with all that in the background, it hit me even harder. And so that sort of epiphany of how important the nervous system is, how important the electrical system is in the body, that's part of what inspired me to then, after engineering, I went and did additional graduate work here, also at the University of Texas in Austin, in neuroscience. And it's a big part of what we do. So you as an SNH listener, are likely a practitioner and already know, of course, that the nervous system sends electrical signals, and those are action potentials. And when they reach the end of the axon and they act on the next cell, they cause a release of various chemicals. So we are electrochemical beings. And as you also know, most interventions are targeted chemically. We can also, however, go upstream and work electrically. And so when thinking about the nervous system, I think it's really useful to think about two components to that. I think even before that, I think it's important to use this framework of thinking about hardware and software. You're familiar with computers. There's the hardware of the computer, right? There's the monitor that you look at, the keyboard you type into, the speaker, all the processors inside, all the transistors, resistors, capacitors. And then there's the software that tells the hardware what to do. And so we're the same in our bodies, right? We have bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, discs, organs. Then there's the software that the electrical signals, or electrochemical signals, yes, but the electrical signals that tell them what to do. So, okay, nothing new for you there, but that framework I think is useful. And then within the software side, there's the nervous system that we know a lot about with the action potentials. And then there's also this slower varying perineural system that's in the fascial connective tissue scaffolding, that matrix around the nerves. And both are relevant and important to healing. In neuroscience, I studied a lot, and about the muscle inhibition or protective guarding that happens in response to injury. And so that's super relevant, because when you have trauma, like I had these torn ligaments, the muscles around it, some of them are going to be tightening and guarding to try to brace that area and reduce movement. Others are going to be shut down, again, with an eye towards reducing movement. It's part of this protective suite of neurological patterns there. And what that does is that excess tension, for example, can reduce blood flow, and it can make muscles less able to move to accommodate force and protect that area as it heals. So that's relevant there locally for supporting or not supporting healing. And then also the nervous system globally. You also know about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, parasympathetic. And for growth and repair to happen, we need to have enough time in that parasympathetic dominant state, right? So there's ways to find, for example, where the nervous system is imposing those patterns locally, through especially direct current electrical stimulation. Also ways to help shift the autonomic nervous system. And then there's also this perineural system, which I don't even really talk about as much, but to get a complete picture, it's very useful. So some of you may have heard of a book called The Body Electric by Robert Becker. And
you're stealing my next question, but keep going.
And in that book, he talks about, and this is from the late 1980s, he talks about this current of injury or charge of injury that happens in this perineural system, the scaffolding around the axons, around the nerves, and it too conducts charge. The action potentials are more like a binary, on-off, or a digital, on-off, 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 whereas this is slower varying, more like a background biasing electric field. And one fascinating part about this perineural system is that whenever there's trauma locally in the body, it creates this charge of injury or current of injury. It creates this electric field that actually guides the healing process. It will, like we know, for example, bradykinin and other inflammatory markers, other inflammatory cells and molecules are negatively charged, and then some are going to be positively charged, and they're going to be drawn in certain directions by that electric field. And so that actually influences, you could even say controls or guides the healing process. The macrophages coming in to clear out debris, and then the subsequent rebuilding of, in most cases, some scar tissue or, hopefully healthier tissue. And then there's a so we as humans and other more complex organisms like, frogs and all other mammals have this process. And then if you contrast that process to salamanders, there's a fascinating, sorry, there's a little bit of a tangent, but fascinating.
No, keep going.
Fascinating shift.
All right. This podcast is brought to you by Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, where we educate doctors and healthcare practitioners on perspective shifts, the main one being from disease to health. All of you listening to this know that our healthcare system is really just a form of disease management. And look, we do a lot of amazing things in our healthcare system, but the one thing that you can't really find, health optimization. So if you're looking to educate yourself or become a practitioner, head on over to homehope.org. And if you're one of those sexy science nerds that are listening to this podcast, you can come and join us at our symposium, October 17th and 18th. 2025 in Boulder, Colorado, in the lovely Chautauqua National Park. We have a few tickets left. If you want to check that one out, again, homehope.org. If you're listening to this, you get a discount. Podcast 10 will get you 10% off either a module if you want to geek out with us, or the symposium if you want to geek out with us in person. So we hope that you'll geek out with us soon. Let's get back to the podcast.
When you look at what happens to a salamander for the first 5 to 7 days, the electric field that happens, if you amputate their limb, salamanders are the most complex organism, most complex animal that can regenerate entire limbs. So if you amputate a salamander's limb, for the first 5 to 7 days, their electric field is going to be the same as ours to guide that early healing process. But then it abruptly shifts significantly in the opposite direction, and it actually triggers this amazing regenerative process that includes cell dedifferentiation. That electric field actually controls cells. So it's different cells, especially in this case, red blood cells, but I think even other ones do too. They de-differentiate back into stem cells so that they can become the tissues and structures of that new limb. And the electric field actually guides, it tells those new stem cells where to go, where to deposit, and what types of cells to become. And scientists know this because if you artificially if you apply a different electric field and you block it or amplify it, you actually change the outcomes of this. You can get a salamander to grow an arm where it had a tail or stuff like that by changing the electric field. So there's this amazing kind of dual nature to the software. One is it sends these signals, action potentials, to control immediate function. And then there's also this other nature of the electric fields that's working more in the background to control healing and regenerative processes. And in both cases, they are direct current, and we're actually working to attempt to tap into both of those components of that underlying electrical control system, both the faster immediate action potential control system and then that slower varying electric field influencing the healing process.
So because, look, we've covered this lightly in another podcast on SNH, and it was more at an academic level and some of the work that Michael Levin is directly doing. But I want to dive into this whole bioelectrical understanding of the human body. Where are we in understanding that role of bioelectricity in healing? Because you mentioned salamanders a lot. You mentioned various other frogs. What do we know about humans healing and bioelectricity at this moment? Because it seems, I mean, I've known you for a long time. You've been doing a lot of work in this, but where are we on sort of the continuum of knowledge?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, my first part of the answer is going to be to say that we're not as far along as I wish or as far along as I believe we should be, when you consider that Robert Becker wrote this book in the late 1980s.
Yeah, exactly. Like what's happened since the 1980s, and
not nearly as much. And I believe that's because we've invested so many resources, scientists, research dollars, so many of those resources into more chemical-based, pharmaceutical approaches, right? Mm-hmm. Those are sort of the dominant medical paradigm these days. And this is something that I am very passionate about. And we just did a study, for example, that I'll mention because it is, as far as I'm aware, it's the first study to compare head to head in humans the effects of alternating current versus direct current. So I'll mention that. I'll go into that here because this notion of using direct current is interesting too. There's some interesting history here. When you look at the field of electrophysiology, if you're if you think electrophysiology, you likely think of TENS units or Russian stim. If you spend a little more time in the field, perhaps you think of interferential or FES or NMES. And those are all alternating current signals because of this very interesting history. I mentioned that both of these faster action potential portion of the nervous system and these slower varying electric fields that control activity in the background, they both use direct current. And there were benefits of using direct current known back around the same time, even earlier, 1960s, 1970s. But there was always this significant problem, which is when you turn it up to a high enough level to make a therapeutic difference in the body, it would literally sting and burn the skin. And so it was a case of the proverbial baby being thrown out with the bathwater, where they saw, okay, we can't use this. So
let's go to something easier.
They just got rid of it altogether. And so in its place came all of these alternating current devices. And
the problem there is not like for like, or what did you kind of gather that the huge problem with all of those are?
So there's a few. It is because it's not like for like, as you said, Boomer. There's a couple things that happen. One is even at lower levels, when you introduce alternating current signals into the body, there is a bit of a shift towards sympathetic activity. There's going to be a little bit of a stress response because that signal is foreign to the body. Not just like stress response from, I'm turning it up and it's high, even at lower levels. I mean there. And then the other is that you miss out on this ability to apply these direct current electric fields and tap into that other slower varying portion of the electrical system of the body. And then there's also this other component where, in terms of the electrical control system, the action potential side of the nervous system, when you turn up an alternating current device, the signal goes back and forth, positive, negative. That's what alternating means. It goes back and forth. Electrons flow in one direction, then the other. So you end up sending this signal that, again, when you turn it up to a high enough level to make a difference in the neuromuscular system, you send a signal that causes agonist-antagonist co-contraction, where that causes, it'd be like if your bicep and tricep are fighting each other when you're trying to move your arm, or if you were driving your car, hitting the throttle and the brake pedal at the same time. There's just a lot of resistance in the body there. And that becomes a limiting factor on how much input, how much power you can get into the body, into the nervous system. So with direct current, you can bypass that stress response. You can bypass the co-contraction, that internal resistance, and get more input signal into the nervous system, especially that sensory afferent side of the nervous system. And then you also have the opportunity to take advantage of these electric fields. So the electric fields we've already talked about are relevant for healing. There's so many interesting examples in the body electric. I go back to that book every couple of years, and it just fascinates me, excites me every time. Makes
have
me think,
it right over here on my bookshelf.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it makes me think, like, I really do wish to intend to move this field further. And so I'll mention one study that we've done that's really cool. But one other fascinating part of the book, there's so many interesting examples. But, there's this underlying polarity in the body where we will have one direction of electric field when we're awake and conscious and alert. And then during sleep or deep meditation, it'll switch into the opposite direction. Brain, one polarity, and then out of the periphery, the other. And so with we do one protocol that we call our master reset or our electric meditation, and we're stimulating the vagus nerve, and there's some mechanisms on that action potential side of the nervous system, but we're also using the polarity that's correlated with those deeper states of relaxation. And so I believe, and this is part of your question of moving the field forward and figuring out how we measure this, how we tap it, and then harness that and tap into it and start to use this as a path forward in medicine. But one of the things that we do is match that polarity that's associated with the deeper, more restorative, restful states. And, we do see a greater shift in heart rate variability and parasympathetic activity there. So there's a couple really interesting applications that we're already looking at. And then I'll mention this study that I alluded to here. So this study that we did with diabetic peripheral neuropathy patients. So you may know, I was surprised to find, but you may know that almost 10% of our population has peripheral neuropathy in this country alone. That's 30 something million
I
people.
actually didn't know that. I knew a lot of people had diabetes, but like, wow, that's shocking.
Yeah. So peripheral neuropathy is, essentially, as especially if you're a clinician listening to this, you already know that there's excess blood sugar or blood sugar dysregulation damages microvasculature, damages blood vessels. First is the microcapillaries, especially down in the periphery and the feet. And so that diminishes the blood supply to the peripheral nerves, which causes those nerves to atrophy. And so peripheral neuropathy is very common. And the traditional standard of care, quite frankly, sucks. It's about, symptom management, palliative care, but there's nothing that anyone is doing that will genuinely help people restore function, improve their, ability to live life and perform at a higher level. So we got to do this really fascinating study with 150 diabetic neuropathy patients. 75 of them got traditional alternating current, TENS unit, and then 75 got the direct current of the NeuFit device. And with the 75 who got traditional alternating current, they did have some improvements in pain, right? Some reductions in their pain symptoms, which is good. There's some benefit there, but that was it. It's what most people expected would happen. The other 75 who got the direct current, they actually, not only did they have at least as much, if not more, improvement in pain, but they saw increased sensation. They improved their abilities to perform activities of daily living. And with EMG and nerve conduction velocity, we saw improvements. So EMG amplitude improvements, that actually means there's axon regeneration in just 2 sessions a week for 6 weeks in a population where this is, unheard of.
Yeah.
There's improvements in nerve conduction velocity, which correlates therefore with remyelination. So we're actually seeing how these direct current electric fields are influencing those healing and regenerative processes in the body that we talked about earlier.
So you mentioned healing regeneration. You mentioned diabetic or peripheral neuropathy. I want to talk a little bit about other use cases here and to set the stage. I don't even know if you remember this, but when I first met you, it was at a conference in your homeland of Austin, which you were a front runner, or sorry, a forerunner. You kind of got to Austin before everybody else decided to move to Austin, but we met at a conference, and one of your colleagues, this time I was doing powerlifting, and I had issues with my right quadricep. He hooked me up to the NeuFit and had me go through a handful of exercises, and like the way he described it was that my quadricep came back online for like the first time in forever long. As somebody who didn't have the background and education at that time that you did, and I think you even pointed me to Robert Becker's book, but it was just sort of enlightening in how quick it was. You also mentioned at the beginning of the show, Caleb. What's the continuum of people that you can work with on this device, and what do some of those people look like? We've talked a lot about healing and rehab here, but maybe even kind of edging more on the performance side. What does that look like using, let's say, DC currents or even, AC? We can get into sort of the difference between DC and what people would think of as an EMS as well.
That question about the continuum is really good. And then we can talk about where your quad injury and your experience fits on there. So we've seen benefits of using this NeuFit methodology with elite professional athletes. I haven't done a ton with Caleb Williams yet, so I'm not going to take credit for anything, but we've worked a lot with big name athletes like Saquon Barkley, graciously did a video for us and talked about how this helped him recover and turn his quad muscle back on. Of course, he had a huge
win. Big Super Bowl win last year, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'll send you the link to that video too, Boomer. So some people like Mike Tyson, Carl Anthony Towns, who's still going in the playoffs right now. We'll see. So there's really amazing things happening there on that sports medicine performance side, and then there's also applications for certainly post-surgery, general population with, low back pain or general aches and pains. And then there's also, chronic pain, more serious, like complex regional pain syndrome, and MS, neuropathy, stroke, spinal cord injury. help people recovering from there. And then, general fitness and athletic performance and longevity in the sense of muscle building and mobility and healthy movement. And it sounds almost like I'm talking about, well, some sort of panacea, but there is a common thread throughout all of those use cases, and that is the nervous system. So when you talk about your quad injury, or we talk about Saquon Barkley recovering from the knee surgery that he had a few years ago at the time we're us having this conversation, the common thread there is the nervous system. So your quad, you're having these issues, quote unquote, firing or activating or facilitating your quad. And that is because, your quad doesn't just decide not to come to work today, right? It does what the nervous system tells it to do. And so your nervous system is actually imposing some sort of governor, limiting protective pattern on there. It's inhibiting that quad for a reason. We have to find what that reason is. And when we do, we are often able to turn it back on very quickly. So this is more in the action potential side of the nervous system that people are generally more familiar with. When you see results in one session, we're not really doing that longer term healing over days or weeks sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting too, because there's a little bit of an opportunity to, I'll say, diagnose in air quotes how much of someone's pain or injury is truly structural, how much of it is really based on damage that does need time to heal, versus how much of it is that functional response, the neurological guarding, inhibition, hypersensitivity, perception of threat that leads to pain, deficit in proprioception that causes the body to protect and want to restrict movement, those sorts of things. And so with your quad, when you see results in one session, it's not that longer term healing. What you're doing is you are helping the nervous system recalibrate, re-educate, helping it understand that it can start to engage that quad again. So you're either finding something else that was not working properly, that's now a lot like for instance, if you have instability in your hip or low back, your nervous system might limit quad activity because it doesn't want you to contract hard and put a lot of force through a compromised joint in the hip or lumbar spine or SI joint. So, it could be something like that, or it could be that you had learned because of trauma or bad habits to reduce activity in your quad. And so sending the signal from there is sort of like a form of exposure therapy to help your brain see that it's safe to allow it to come back online again. So those faster results, that's probably what we're best known for, is this mapping process where you actually do what I just described. You actually take an electrode and scan around on the body and find where those guarding or protective or inhibitory patterns are being imposed, where there's deficits in proprioception. Find that so that we can make those breakthroughs, those aha moments, and help people make progress right away and tell how much of it is functional versus how much is structural. So there's a really cool component to that. And then there's also, once you've worked through those neurological limitations, that's what I consider to be rehabilitation. Is finding those deficits and bringing them back up to baseline. And then from there, there's a question of, okay, how do we now increase the functional capacity of the entire system? How do we bring that baseline up higher? And that's where we get into fitness and performance. Depends on what someone's goals are. So, it might be a very noble goal of just wanting to stay active and increase health span and lifespan and longevity and be able to maintain muscle mass and be able to move and be active without pain, right? Or it could be, go have 2,000 yards rushing in an NFL season or win a gold medal at the Olympics, whatever it might be. In those cases, the nervous system still applies, but we can do things like work on, at the high end of elite athletic performance, we can teach certain muscles to contract and relax to increase motor control in certain ranges of motion. So we can improve precision or speed of contraction or speed of relaxation.
The second sponsor of this show, and really we only have 2 sponsors ever because this is internally generated content, is Transcriptions. And Transcriptions, what we do is we produce novel formulas in the form of a novel delivery mechanism with a novel ingredient lists. You can think of TroZ and 8 different novel ingredients addressing all aspects of sleep architecture. You know what my favorite thing about TroZ is that when I wake up in the middle of the night and that my brain gets going, I go crazy because I have so many ideas of things that I want to do, I can get back to sleep. And that's just amazing. And why is that? Well, we have a GABA agonist in there, called Agrin. We have a positive allosteric modulator, the GABA receptor in there called Hanakyle. If that really just kind of jazzes you up in a good way, or if you don't know what that is, it just means that you're able to relax a hell of a lot easier and perhaps get back to sleep. If you want to check out Trozy, go over to showscriptions.com and hit the code POD10 and you'll get 10% off your purchase. Let's get back to the show.
And then for general fitness, we can do things like help people, increase their mobility and activation so those new ranges of motion are safe, and we can get them to recruit more motor units so you can get the benefits of weightlifting but without having to lift as heavy and therefore have as much risk of injury or re-injury. So there's applications there. Just on that last topic, one interesting thing to think about, which you likely already know, I just don't think we really articulate this, but when one is lifting a weight, actually start off, if I'm just doing a bicep curl, I'm flexing my elbow, it only takes me a small percentage of the motor units, the muscle fibers in my bicep to lift that arm, right? Maybe it takes, call it 10%. Then when I put a dumbbell in my hand, I have to engage maybe 20 or 30%. A heavier dumbbell, maybe I have to engage 40%. Heavier dumbbell, maybe 50 or 60%. So you use weight as a stimulus as a source of feedback to force you to engage more muscle fibers and more motor units.
Yeah.
We can use electricity to stimulate more motor units, more muscle fibers, so you can get that benefit without having to lift as much mechanical weight and get as much load or strain or risk of damage on your joints.
Yeah, just an interjection of a story here. Yep. I remember do you still have the facility in Westlake?
Yeah, that's our HQ, our home office.
So I remember going to HQ, and this is at that sort of powerlifting time. And I have a photo of this somewhere, but I showed up and I was going to do just a workout because I think you told me just to come and try and work out with it rather than use it as sort of physical therapy device. And it's one of those things that's sort of like blood flow restriction training where somebody tells you to like just use the 5-pound dumbbells and you don't believe them at first. And then you get there, and this was with your powerlifting friend at the time. And he's just like, yeah, just use the bar. And I was like, okay, buddy, like, I'll need a little bit more weight than that. He's like, no, you won't. And the next day I hadn't felt that much. Well, I wouldn't say it was DOMS. It was like a different feeling. Like you just have a full activation of all of the muscles that you worked out rather than having to put on 400, 500 pounds on the bar or whatever it was, right? It was a pretty incredible experience.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the type of thing that we see all the time. We actually have a couple of published studies looking at that effect, and we've seen similar muscle growth with traditional weightlifting over a 6 or 8 week training cycle compared to doing the Neubie with no or very low external load. So we see similar growth there. And there is one good question that sometimes people ask, well, does that give you everything that you need? And if you're not getting as much mechanical tension, you may not as much axial loading. One question I have that is something that we will explore in the next few years is what, if any, effect is there of doing this on bone density? We know we can get similar benefits on muscle growth. I don't yet have the information to be able to claim that it helps as much with bone density. So that's one question I have. And I know if you're going to compete in powerlifting too, this is great. It gives you the effects that you, Boomer, described, but you also do need to have the feeling of heavy weight, otherwise, if you're not used to that feeling, your joint receptors in your spine, for example, are just going to trigger these reflexes to shut down muscles. So you still have to see the weight occasionally. But if you're not competing in powerlifting, you can do this, you can do a lot of this and stay healthy and move better and generally feel better.
So a couple of follow-on questions here, because you mentioned like the process of the mapping and then correcting defects and then working on functional capacity. And one of the things I want to draw attention to is something that you said earlier about this. And I can't remember the exact words you used, but it was like an electric meditation. And so somebody might be listening to this and say like, oh, is this whole episode about physical performance? But let's talk a little bit about how the actions that you're doing here and kind of rewiring the nervous system may play a role in stress response and being able to, just go kick ass mentally as well.
Oh man, this is such a great topic, and there's a few different parts of this that I want to dive into. One is the effects of exercise on the brain. There's all this great research on how moving the body impacts the brain. It helps with release of things like BDNF and VEGF and these growth factors, and also neurotransmitter production. And then there's also the effects of handling stress. And then there's also this realm of physiological psychology, which, if you're listening to this podcast, you likely are familiar with the concepts or have read books like The Body Keeps the Score and understand how patterns of tension in the body, how we tense the body in certain ways to carry on even emotional offenses or fears or responses to things that have happened in the past. We still carry those with us in the forms of physical tension. And so there's so many ways that working the body can impact cognitive performance and brain function and our everyday experience of life. So in that, kind of perhaps going in order through those, there are, looking at cognitive function, I hear so many times, I lose count, on a daily basis. We hear people that come into our clinic in Austin, they talk about how after they do one of these workouts, they feel like just the lights are shining brighter in their brain. They feel like their mood and affect is better. Some people have talked about how, I'm not making any claims or telling anyone they should change their prescriptions or something, but people have told us that they are able to reduce or get off of some of these antidepressant type medications and things like that. And the benefit there, as far as we can tell, again, in a good area for further study, is these well-known effects of exercise on the brain. Moving the body does profoundly impact the brain. The credible neuroscientists have said that they believe the biggest reason we have evolved the brains that we have, the complexity and size and energy demands of these brains, is because of all the complex movements that we can do. And then, of course, the complex social interactions that we have. But in terms of movements, we're the only animal that can, do a push-up and a pull-up and run and walk and crawl and throw an implement and carry things, right? So all these different things that we can do. So when we move, there's so much activity in the brain as it monitors and controls and guides that movement. And then when you amplify that with electrical stimulation, you're getting more of that signal going up to the brain, and therefore more activity and more release of neurotransmitters and more release and stimulation of brain-derived neurotrophic factor and vascular endothelial growth factor and the other wonderful chemicals there that are they're like miracle grow fertilizer for the neurons and synaptic connections. So there's really wonderful benefits there. And then kind of going along, sort of the other area is definitely with stress management. You mentioned, Boomer, that master reset or that electric meditation that we had talked about earlier, and that is, it's a really powerful process. If you imagine you lie down, you know what diaphragmatic breathing is. So if you lie down and do diaphragmatic breathing for 10 or 20 minutes, you're likely going to see an increase in your heart rate variability, which is a proxy for parasympathetic nervous system activation. And we've measured this and we see that. And if you do this master reset protocol, if you have the what's called the Neubie device for neurobioelectric stimulator, the NeuFit device, if you have that on these certain locations, you will stimulate the vagus nerve and get this electrical polarity that we talked about that correlates with these deeply meditative or restorative or sleep-like states. If you do that, the increase in heart rate variability during that 10 or 20 minutes is going to be 2, 3, 4 times higher. So you see this amazing shift in heart rate variability, which of course shifts into parasympathetic mode, gives you a chance to recover so that you're better able, more recovered, more replenished, better able to handle the next bout of stress when it occurs, and better able to access that state so you don't get stressed out in the sense of being able to just feel as overwhelmed or have a short fuse and lose your temper or things like that. So there's impact there. And then in this realm of physiological psychology, I'm just trying to go through mentally in order the different topics I laid out there. In physiological psychology, when we do that mapping process, when we scan around on the body, we're finding a few things. We're finding areas where there's guarding and tension. We're finding areas where there's inhibition. We're finding areas where there might be a deficit in proprioception. And that's an interesting one, just a little aside, because if you have a deficit in proprioception, as you know, the brain is constantly monitoring the body and paying attention to the inputs that are coming in from all the different mechanoreceptors, all the different nerve sensors out in the body. And if there's not so proprioception is that sense of the brain watching or monitoring where the body is in space. And if there's a deficit in information coming up to the brain can't tell as clearly where that part of the body is in space. And so if it can't tell where your left leg is in space, it's concerned that you might step on a sharp object or kick something that could harm you, or step in hot lava, right? It doesn't know. And so it'll actually limit movement there. So that's one of the things that we're able to find. Interesting discussion there. But as we find these patterns of tension, you can find something, in the abdomen or diaphragm that's part of like your body sort of bracing, this very central flexor-based protective pattern, very, very kind of primal pattern. You can find something there. And I've seen examples where we'll scan around and someone finds something there and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I just remembered this time that I fell, or this time from a childhood when my mother yelled at me, or something like these things that come up that speak to this notion of physiological
body keeping the score.
Exactly. Yeah. And then working through that can help free up some of those psycho-emotional patterns as well.
This is fascinating. I think there's there's a time limit on this interview, but there's a couple of things that I want to just differentiate here between what you're doing with the Neubie and at NeuFit versus something that may be in the mainstream parlance. EMS. Is that all just AC, or what are we talking about here? Because somebody might listen to this and say, well, hey, I have my EMS suit. What am I doing differently here with the Neubie?
It's a good question and definitely worth clarifying. So EMS, if that is electrical muscle stimulation, is sort of an umbrella term that would, depending on how you look at it, would technically include what we're doing and then what's generally available in the market. Typically, when people are using that, they are talking about the TENS units, interferential Russian stim, the EMS suits, and those are virtually everything that people are generally referring to is going to be alternating current, and then the difference with this is direct current and all the engine.
So when we talk about that book, you and I have talked about the book Super Training before, I think, right? And I can't remember the Russian side. Yeah.
Oh, and Yuri Verkhoshansky.
Yeah. So I'm glad you remember his name, right? And in there, he talks about how you can take a muscle's performance to like 120 or whatever percent. I don't remember the exact numbers. You probably do. Is he talking about using EMS in that case, or were the Russians using DC?
So this is an interesting nuance. What we call quote unquote Russian stim today is a stereotypical alternating current, specific type of current. And the Russians, back in the heyday of the Soviet sports science era, the 1960s, 1970s, they were experimenting with all types of currents. So they used both alternating current and direct current. They used different types. They're the ones that found, I mentioned back in the 60s and 70s that many of these benefits of direct current were known, but there was always that problem of stinging and burning the skin. The Soviets actually burned several of their athletes doing some of these experiments. And of course, we couldn't do that here in the West. So that's part of why it fell out of favor. So there's a difference between what the Soviet sports scientists did and what we call today the defined term Russian current or Russian stim. So they experimented with different types. They used both direct current and alternating current. And some of what they did, what they talked about in that book was these so-called supramaximal contractions, where you would get someone to contract their muscle as hard as they could isometrically and then add electrical stimulation on top of it, turn it up. They would have people biting down on leather because they were screaming and it was so intense. So they would turn it up literally as much as the person could tolerate and see if they could get them to increase their force a little bit. And they worked on trying to close that gap of getting people to consciously create their maximum amount of force so that when they turned the electrical stimulation up, there was no longer any increase because they were already activating as much as they could without the assistance of electrical stimulation. So they did those experiments. Some of those, when they're just doing that barrage like that barrage of just increasing, you perhaps would be able to do that with alternating current. And I'm not sure.
That sounds like a lot of sympathetic nervous system activation.
Yeah. So that particular, that's one of the main references that they, kind of use cases that they talk about in super training. There's a few others with electrical stimulation, but that's the one where they talked about increasing muscle strength and muscle firing. So that I'd have to go back and look and see what type of current they used, if it's even mentioned.
I don't think they disclosed it in the book, but it's been a long time since I've read Yuri's book. In fact, in preparing for this, I just kind of glanced at it on the shelf because I knew I was talking to my friend Garrett, who knows this book way better than I do. Garrett, what do you think the world of electroceuticals is going to be like in the next 5 to 10 years? Because you guys are really pioneering here, right? Like, you're pushing the research forward, you're getting people to try new things, you're doing studies. What does it look like in the next 5, 10 years?
I look forward to finally being able to use some of these principles from the body electric, to use electric fields to precisely modulate and guide the healing process in the body. I think that it's possible to have salamander-like regenerative properties in humans. I don't know if that's the next 5 years or the next 15 years, but
you and Michael Levin would agree on that one. So
yeah. So I think that is certainly part of it. One of the big things that I think I appreciate that, mention that we're, sort of pioneering or leading this electroceutical field. One of the things that I think that's true. What I'm consciously even probably more aware of is really leading the conversation in this nervous system first approach, and really helping people think about the software at least as prominently, or at least as early in the rehabilitation process as they think about the hardware, where we've been in this model of a very hardware dominant, hardware focused paradigm where the interventions are focused on the structures and tissues of the body. So that's where I think about, and the electroceutical piece, the electrical piece of that sort of dovetails with it. But I'm excited for that. I also, I had mentioned earlier this notion of there being different electrical fields associated with sleeping versus wakeful and alert states of consciousness. And so I believe that at some point we're going to be able to have electrical anesthesia, where instead of having to have those, pharmaceutical drugs that are toxic to the liver and that take a while to come off of. And, I had one orthopedic surgery and I didn't take any pain meds. I actually had an amazing recovery thanks to the Neubie, the different story. But the thing that I felt absolute worst was just a day of like feeling like the worst hangover ever, coming off of all the anesthetic and stuff. So I think there's a day when we can apply either an electrical or magnetic field to the brain and shift the polarity to make one unconscious and create an electrically induced anesthesia state. So that's something that I think there's really amazing opportunities, and I'm excited. A lot of the research that we have done so far that I've alluded to, these published studies on neuropathy, on muscle hypertrophy. We have a few others on MS, functional recovery in MS patients. We just had a case study. So caveat, one case study, but published in the Journal for Integrative Medicine on an ALS patient, and
wow,
and pretty amazing results with the NeuFit methodology as well. So there's, this admittedly is more in the clinical realm, because we just work in that clinical world every day. I would love to work with, and we have some university research partners that may be able to be involved with this, and perhaps you listening to this have some ideas, and we'd love to talk about that as well. But I'd love to also see some more basic science about these electric fields. It's just funding that, and we're a relatively, in the grand scheme of things, smaller company and aren't able to do quite as much basic science. But what we saw in that neuropathy study was at least something that can be built upon in that realm for sure.
So I know you don't double click anymore on computers, but I'm going to double click on that with sort of a final question. If you had a blank check to do any sort of study and there's no roadblocks from the government, issues with any sort of external parties, what would it be?
If I'm not harming any people or animals, I truly don't have to worry about that, and funding is no issue, I would work on using electric fields to reduce the size of tumors. And I would work on attempting to regenerate limbs and organs of the body with electric fields.
Very cool. Garrett, one final question that we ask everybody, and just because like you're in this space of broadly speaking health optimization, and health optimization has a long continuum, what's one piece of advice that you would give people if they wanted to live smarter, not harder? And it doesn't have to be your own device.
Ooh. Live smarter, not harder. You already talk about and have products for sleep. So everything that I say is gonna come with the caveat that if you're not sleeping well, nothing else matters. But so let's just assume that. I would say, go back to part of the conversation we had here about the effect of movement on the brain and overall health. I would say find a way or multiple ways to joyfully, easily, and more of a habit than a sense of effort, work movement into your life. So finding sports and hobbies and fitness practices and different things, because I think that's one of the biggest problems today is how sedentary we are. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons for many health challenges. And of course, there's environmental toxins and nutrition and stress and stuff like that. But I think that movement is so, as we've talked about, so fundamental to who we are and our experience of life. And it's such a that mechanotransduction. When we move, we get, literally that mechanical force gets translated into electrical signals that have profound effects on all these things that we've talked about in the body and in health and longevity. So to me, I think that's just such a big deal, whether it's walking while taking phone calls or picking up a sport and a hobby and, training in the gym, all these different things. And movement is more broad. Exercise is just one piece of that, but movement is sort of anything, whether it's a yoga or tai chi, martial arts, dance practice, do something, challenge yourself, and find something that's sustainable, that you like, that feels good, and keep doing that. I think that's just so huge. Can't undersell the importance of that.
Garrett, where can people find out more about you, NeuFit, and what you're doing?
There's a few places. If you are on social media, please connect with us. We're most active on Instagram and then also Facebook. I have a personal page, which is my first and last name, Garrett.Salpeter on Instagram. And then our business page is NeuFit RFP for Rehab, Fitness, and Performance, NEUFIT RFP. And then our website is www.neu.fit, NEU, like neurological.fit.
Very cool. Garrett, always a pleasure catching up, my friend. Maybe one of these days we'll do it in Chicago over a Blackhawks game or something. But yes. Thank you for making the time today.
Likewise. Yeah, I'd love that. Next Chicago trip, I'll reach out to you for sure. We'll get something on the calendar.
Beautiful. To everybody listening out there, enjoy your day. And always remember to live smarter, not harder. Thank you. Good times with good friends, and that's what we'll call that conversation. Garrett, once again, is the founder of NeuFit. You can find them at neu.fit. And if you wanted to try out the Neubie, please just go on their website, send them an email. They'll connect you to somebody, hopefully in your area. Again, we covered a lot in this conversation, talking about super training and how the Soviets used to use electrostim to really force muscle contraction. We talked about electroceuticals and perhaps some of the stuff that this might have some overlap in the future with what Michael Levin is doing. Michael Levin has been on the show before. If you want to go and tune into that one, it's a good follow-up conversation to this. We talked a bit about nervous system resets and how we can use direct current for that, and a lot more. So if you want to find out more about what Garrett's doing, I already referenced his website, but please come out, check out the podcast, check out other episodes. Smarter Not Harder podcast, anywhere podcasts are fine. Leave us a 5-star rating or smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube. Have a wonderful day.